even in the face of instruction. So a lot of these subjects that I've tested have had multiple years of biology. Some of them are biology majors, but they still hold a transformational theory of evolution. So they don't seem to be responsive to evidence, but I think that they would be. I think if there was the right instruction, that the theories would change. But in other cases, they don't seem to be defeasible at all. I don't think there is any evidence that could potentially change a person's beliefs about God from, say, anthropomorphic to non-anthropomorphic. That's more of a personal choice. Computational structure. Well, I'm not a computational psychologist, so I don't really have much to say on this, and I don't think the data do either. But the one thing I'll mention, if you're interested in computation, is that there's this growing movement to analyze these kinds of data, theory-based inference, beliefs, concepts, in terms of Bayes nets. So it seems very abstract. Like maybe we can figure out how vision is represented computationally, but beliefs? Well, people are making progress on that using stuff that looks like that, but I'm not going to go into it. Innate foundations. This is where I think the data are really kind of interesting. I think that when you do a very in-depth analysis of beliefs, even adults' beliefs in these various domains, you see evidence of early modes of construal. That the beliefs that children have are constraining the beliefs that adults eventually form. And I don't mean to suggest that a lot of adults are childish. It's just that's the pattern of development, and that there's a reason why we go to 12 years of school and then 4 years of college and then more school after that. It's because schooling is needed to change these intuitive conceptions that you form from very early on. They're very deeply entrenched. So in the case of evolution, I talked about essentialism as being the bugaboo. And essentialism is very easily explained in an innate way in terms of categorization. There's lots of evidence that infants come into the world forming visual categories. And if you form a category, there must be something in common with all those members. So it's very easy to go from forming a category to assuming there's an essence that underlies that category. And then essentialism then acts as a constraint on your understanding of evolution, leading you to have a transformational theory. You can tie what I've been studying in the religion back to intentional attribution. So there's lots of evidence that infants come into the world and they sort of divide the world into two things, objects and agents. And when infants watch people interact with the world, they don't have the same predictions about their interactions with the world as they have for, say, objects interacting. I don't have time to go into that. But I think intentional attribution is the foundation for anthropomorphization of everything. I mean, there's lots of evidence that we anthropomorphize everything from cars to computers to nature. And then it's just a short leap from anthropomorphizing a natural tendency to do that to creating a humanistic theology. And the last thing, interpersonal variability. I think these data suggest that sometimes individual differences among adults, even well-educated adults, are grounded in developmental differences between children and adults. That when you see these huge differences between, say, a 4-year-old and a college student, and you see a little amount of difference among the college students, it's sort of like that little difference among the college students is the same as the big difference between the kids and the college students, just at a larger scale. And that those patterns, that early patterns of reasoning through the process of education are not actually supplanted, but they're suppressed. And that there is differing degrees of suppression among adults. Lee Richardson is studying that right now for her comps presentation, so you could ask her about some other data that are relevant to that. So I'll just leave it at that and open up for questions. Ms. Woolman, your New Yorker talking.
Were the responses of the participants really multiple choice, or like were the options given to them, or did they respond like written?
For the God questions?
Yeah.
It was all mixed. It depends on the task. I'm just summarizing the gist of it, but there were different formats. So like the property attribution questions were closed-ended. You had to say yes or no, angels, sneeze, and like yes or no, God is all-powerful. But then there were other things like what is God that were open-ended in nature. So you see evidence of humanistic interpretation in both formats. And I think that's something that, as a cognitive developmentalist, I always gravitate to. I like a mixed methods approach, because you want findings that are reliable regardless of how you ask the question. You want to be able to ask the question in multiple ways and still basically get the same pattern of results.
Have you ever come across any catches in people that believe in this variational theory of evolution? And you ask them the questions about the animals, and they'll be very variationally thinking in their responses. Have you found that even though they do that, they might not extend those theories to human evolution and only to animals? Because that's also, I know, is a big controversy.
Right. There's actually a study that was just published last year that I know very well because I was a reviewer for it, where they took my task to assess transformationism versus variationism and couched all the questions in terms of humans, because my original assessment didn't have humans in it at all. I didn't want to get into that. And what they found is that people are better at reasoning about evolution when it's in terms of humans than when it's in terms of non-human animals. And that was just measuring understanding. So it's kind of interesting. You're better at understanding evolution when you think about it in terms of humans, because we naturally understand that humans vary. We see the variation all around us, very perceptive to it. But on the other hand, we're less likely to accept that humans have evolved, more likely to accept that non-human animals have evolved.
Yeah.
Yeah. But the author of that article argued that maybe start with humans as a wedge into the other stuff, because if you really, the educator's task is to...
dogs or something like that.
Yes, dogs, that might work too, because the problem with dogs is that people often think that the different breeds are actually different species. So they don't see that as variation all within the same species. But anyways, you could use humans as sort of a wedge into understanding, and then, as I've shown, understanding is related to acceptance, so maybe then ultimately that will change things.
In your study about how many adults anthropomorphize God, they hold a certain number of humanistic characteristics. They have a chart on that, the two charts. On the bottom, I noticed that there were more people who endorse 45 characteristics. Would that be kind of like a clash between intuitive, what you've been testimonies of what you've been exposed to your?
Oh, actually, no. That would be cool, but I think what it actually is let me pull that up. That's the point at which you start attributing biological and physical properties to God. So there were 4 psychological, 4 biological, 4 physical, and pretty much everybody will attribute psychological properties to God. Thinking, talking, dreaming, possibly that's a little bit more questionable. It's the biological and physical ones that, assuming he has a body, where you see the split. So there were 4 psychological properties, so that's where you start seeing people now moving to biological ones as well. And dreaming, semi-biological, because you have to sleep to dream. So that one was less likely to be endorsed.
Yeah. I have 2 questions, I guess. And first, in what ways do you think creating linguistic dichotomies when asking people God, or does God do blank, and answering yes, no, how do you think that constrains the ability of the researcher to understand people's actual conceptions of God, in the sense that do you think it's filtering through some sort of false dichotomy? And then the second question is, I noticed that there were more the physical descriptions were more common, I think, in the data than biological. Is that, in a sense that the numbers were higher, people were more likely to endorse physical descriptions than biological? I thought I noticed that across several different groups, and I was wondering if you thought that people more likely conceptualized God as an abiological but psychological and physical entity.
Yeah, it's possible. Well, let me start with that and then move backwards. In the original study where kids were part of it, I did a lot of testing of adults in addition to that one piece that I showed you. And you see switches between the biological and physical categories in terms of how often they are endorsed when you switch the properties. So really it's sort of property specific. But it doesn't matter what